Good afternoon and welcome to the Cato Institute. I am Mark Calabria, Director of Financial Regulation Studies here at Cato, and I'm also honored to serve as the moderator for today's book forum. When reading press coverage of the financial crisis, one constantly comes across phrases such as, the banks did this, the banks did that. Lost in these generalities is that there was no one response to the financial crisis or to the events that preceded it. Different firms took different approaches. While several CEOs and their boards made poor decisions that eventually led to their failure, others made good decisions, prudent decisions, and even sometimes brilliant decisions that not only saved their firms, but also allowed these firms to gain market share and come out of the crisis stronger than ever. While in my own writings, I have tended to place considerable emphasis upon the poor public policy choices that caused this crisis, it's important to keep in mind that not every bank responded to these policies in the same manner. Consider for a moment the role of monetary policy leading up to the crisis. The Federal Reserve engineered a very steep yield curve that provided firms with a very strong incentive to borrow short and lend long. I wouldn't say it's an exaggeration that Bear Stearns was largely done in by the extreme mismatch in its assets and liabilities. However, firms chose a different strategy while facing the same yield curve. For instance, the book discusses the funding strategy of Goldman, which, while less profitable at the time, ended up being far more stable. The book discussed today, while some firms thrive while others fail, is fundamentally about why different firms made correct decisions while others did not. I think it's particularly appropriate that today's book forum is being held in the Hayek Auditorium, and although the author does not directly cite Hayek, the core issue identified in the book is one that I believe is central to Hayek's work, that is the use of knowledge. At the risk of overgeneralization, what separated successful firms from the failures was how well management utilized the dispersed information within both their firms and the marketplace. Firms that failed were largely those where management was insulated and depended almost exclusively on their own knowledge. Firms that succeeded were those where management harnessed the information within their firm by creating effective feedback mechanisms. The author, Tom Stanton, will provide us with exactly how and a discussion of which firms were able to utilize this information, this knowledge dispersed within the firm. Let me go back and remember a little bit when I first came to Washington after finishing my doctorate. And one of the first books I was exposed to was Tom's book he wrote in 1991 titled A State of Risk, where the government-sponsored enterprises be the next financial crisis. Clearly, Tom was years ahead of his time, and unfortunately, his predictions came out to be all too accurate. And he's got a very long track record, in my opinion, of being one of the foremost forecasters of the state of the financial services industry in terms of policy. When he is not writing books, he spends his time as a fellow at the Center for Advanced Governmental Studies at the Johns Hopkins University. Tom also served as staff on the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, and while in my opinion, there's a few things I would disagree with in this commission's findings. One thing that I know for certain is that the commission's report and work was far stronger because of Tom's involvement. The book here today is also informed largely by Tom's experience on the commission staff. We are also very fortunate to have with us Alex Pollock to offer his thoughts on the book. Currently, Alex is a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. I first got to know Alex about a decade ago when he was president and chief operating officer of the Federal Home Loan Bank of Chicago, a position he held from 1991 to 2004. And I would also say I've always found Alex to be one of the most insightful commentators on the financial services industry. So with that, I'm going to turn the podium over to Tom.
Thanks very much, Mark. Good afternoon. I think it's afternoon. It's a real pleasure to join you today at the Cato Institute. I'm extremely grateful to Cato, and I want to express my thanks. Years ago, I wrote a monograph that raised questions about the financial soundness of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and then I wrote the book that Mark alluded to, A State of Risk, Will Government-Sponsored Enterprises Be the Next Financial Crisis? Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac didn't like my monograph, and they didn't like my book. And
they didn't like you. And they didn't like you.
And suddenly, it became a little chilly. And Catherine England, who at the time was the head of regulatory affairs at Cato, invited me in out of the cold and said, why don't you present what you have found and what's happening? Came to a luncheon meeting such as this. There were a number of senior federal officials who had simply taken GSEs for granted. And suddenly, we were launched on trying at least to sound the alarm and to reform the structure and the oversight of government-sponsored enterprises. So I'm very grateful to Cato. Unfortunately, as Peter Wallison of AEI has pointed out, our largest financial institutions today are like government-sponsored enterprises. They benefit from the belief that government will bail out their debt holders. Now, shareholders may like high-risk bets, particularly high leverage, because they get the high returns from those high risks, at least until something goes wrong. By contrast, debt holders have traditionally been a force for moderation in the marketplace because they only get a fixed rate of interest, whatever the debt obligation promises, and when the company starts to take more risk, they're disadvantaged. But implicit government backing of the debt of our largest financial institutions mean that this market discipline has suddenly been undermined. So today I want to talk about my new book, Why Some Firms Thrive While Others Fail. And as Mark noted, this builds on my work at the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission. We studied internal documents, I can't tell you how many, from financial institutions and their regulators, interviewed CEOs, risk officers, bankers, traders, regulators, policymakers, and a number of other people to try to understand from everybody's perspective, putting it all together, what went on here. And in 2010, we were still in a stage when people on Wall Street and in the financial system were in shock and were pretty ready to tell us their story. I don't need to tell you, particularly looking at the younger age of this audience, that the financial crisis was immensely expensive with pervasive effects in the country. Maybe 10 million households are going to lose their homes to foreclosure. House prices declined to the point where almost a quarter of homes are worth less than the mortgages on the property. The unemployment rate doubled. Millions of people lost their jobs. Median household wealth fell by trillions of dollars. The poverty rate rose to its highest level in 17 years, and graduating students have a lot harder time finding appropriate work than ever before. Much of this damage might have been avoided or at least mitigated by better governance, risk management, and better management generally in both the public and private sectors. Perhaps the most important task before us, and what I tried to do in writing this book, is to understand the expensive lessons of the crisis for our public and private institutions and how we can avoid these mistakes in the future. In the book, I try to understand the differences between 4 major firms that successfully navigated the crisis and 8 that failed or required government support to stay afloat, which in my book is failure. I studied 4 surviving firms, JP Morgan Chase, Goldman Sachs, Wells Fargo, and Toronto Dominion Bank, now TD Bank, which since the crisis has appeared here in Washington on a number of street corners. JP Morgan Chase's story is of preparing the company in advance to be strong enough to take advantage of long-term opportunities. Goldman's is a firm-wide systems and capacity to react quickly to changes in the environment, and then, of course, tripping heavily over reputational risk. Wells is a company with a culture of customer focus and restraint, and TD Bank provides a simple lesson: if you don't understand it, don't invest in it. Each of these firms applied strong governance, good management, operational competence, and discipline, but with different approaches. Some of these firms have had serious problems since the crisis, and of course, JP Morgan Chase actually lost billions of dollars in their London office in an event that reveals poor risk management. But the point here is these firms had successful strategies for weathering the crisis. There is a huge difference between taking a large loss, such as Morgan recently took, and having the company fail. The companies that failed the crisis didn't just take losses. They went out of business, required massive amounts of taxpayer aid, or entered into mergers that ended their existence as independent companies. Unsuccessful firms included Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, Bear Stearns,